This teenage girl sat in court with confidence, showing no visible grief or remorse for what she had done. She seemed to believe that her calm appearance would convince everyone that she was innocent, but only minutes later, everything about her would begin to fall apart. She and her family claimed this was nothing more than an unintended accident. Her defense attorney also argued that she had not caused the crash on purpose, but had lost consciousness behind the wheel because of a medical condition known as postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS. At first, the defense argument appeared reasonable. The jury considered it, but then prosecutors presented multiple layers of evidence, and everything changed. What you are about to see is the moment Mackenzie Shirilla realized that planning to take lives by staging a crash was not the same as innocence. 2 young men were gone, and the truth about what really happened near Progress Drive and Alameda Drive was hidden in places she never expected. And every detail you are about to see has been verified through court records, law enforcement investigations, courtroom testimony, and the jury's sentencing decision. This became one of the most mysterious and heavily debated cases in the United States in recent years, a case that left many people angry and searching for answers. The questions centered on one disturbing issue: how could such a serious crash take the lives of everyone else in the car while she survived? In this video, you will see the version of the case that includes all the layers of evidence used to show that this was not an accident, but an intentional act. If you have never heard the full evidence in this case before, prepare yourself, because what happened in Brandon, Rankin County, Mississippi, on the 19th of March, 2024, will challenge everything you think about infidelity, manipulation, and how far a person may go to protect a secret. To understand why this teenage girl ended up inside that courtroom and why she was sentenced to life in prison, we first need to understand the full timeline of the case and the lives of the people involved before everything happened. Mackenzie Shirilla was a teenage girl living in Ohio, United States. When the incident happened on the 31st of July 2022, she was only 17 years old. Before the case, Mackenzie was described as a girl who cared deeply about her personal image, social media, and attention from others. Mackenzie was not viewed as an ordinary girl who accidentally became caught in a tragedy, but as someone who had become aware early on of her own image. Mackenzie wanted to be known. She liked posting her life online, turning friends, clothing, parties, and romantic relationships into parts of her personal image. She was a girl who pursued attention, tried to build a perfect public appearance, and was gradually exposed through the case. In school and on social media, Mackenzie was described as a kind of it girl, meaning a girl who wanted to be the center of attention. People who knew her described her as someone who cared deeply about image and recognition on social media. She had a group of girls around her, a noticeable fashion style, and an interest in a polished, upscale image. She liked posing for photos and liked being seen as someone with appeal. Overall, Mackenzie wanted social status, wanted a beautiful image, wanted attention, and did not easily accept losing control in her private life. Dominic Russo was Mackenzie Shirilla's boyfriend. Dominic was 20 years old when he died. Court records showed that Mackenzie and Dominic had known each other since they were in school and had been dating for about 4 years before the crash. Dominic's family had once viewed Mackenzie as part of the family because she was often present at their home. In late 2021 or early 2022, Mackenzie moved in with Dominic. Dominic was not only a boyfriend, but also an important part of Mackenzie's life image. Dominic was older, had his own house near his family, had a recording studio, had musical ambitions, and had business or investment activities. Those factors made Dominic someone who gave Mackenzie a sense of maturity, freedom, status, and content to build her social media image. But more importantly, Dominic was also a victim with his own life, his own future, and his own family. He was not just Mackenzie's boyfriend. He was a young man entering adulthood, with relationships, dreams, plans, and a loving family. When the case happened, that entire future was cut short. Davion Flanagan was the friend who was in the car with Mackenzie and Dominic on the morning of the 31st of July 2022. Davion was 19 years old when he died. According to the timeline of the case, Davion was not at the center of the romantic conflict between Mackenzie and Dominic. He was the person who asked for a ride after the gathering, and then became the second victim in the crash. The painful part of Davion's role is that he appeared to be pulled into a situation he did not create. At first, Mackenzie did not want to let Davion get into the car, but Dominic persuaded her to give him a ride. This detail highlights the tragedy. Davion may have only needed a ride home, but he became a victim in a case whose main motive, according to prosecutors, centered on the relationship between Mackenzie and Dominic. The central relationship was between Mackenzie and Dominic. Court records showed that they had been in a relationship for years, but it was unstable. Dominic's brother testified that Mackenzie and Dominic had broken up multiple times, and in June and July of 2022, Dominic was considering ending the relationship. This was an important detail, because prosecutors later argued that the motive of the case was connected to Mackenzie's inability to accept the possibility of losing Dominic. Mackenzie was described as someone who expected Dominic to drive her, serve her needs, meet her daily and emotional demands, and react when she wanted attention or support. She also reportedly reacted intensely when she was refused. Dominic secretly recorded videos when Mackenzie threatened him.
You broke up with me earlier.
Because you are a little weak.
You broke up with me earlier. You literally broke up with me earlier.
This is your last chance to open the door, or you are not coming out of this house all night, because I will not leave.
You literally broke up with me earlier. Like what is the point you're trying to, like, you broke up with me, like, earlier. Like, what point
No,
are you trying to say?
I didn't.
Yes, you did. You said we're not together. You literally said that. Like, you really broke up with me earlier. Like, what are you trying to make? Like, why would I just let you in my house if you break up with me? You're threatening to break my
No.
Like, you're threatening to key my car. Threatening to break the doors.
I will key your car
like,
if you do not let me in the house.
You're gonna key my car if I don't let you.
If you don't let me in the house, yes.
What the
Yeah, I know, so just let me in the house.
No, like, why can't you just be like calm at least for a second, and I can feel comfortable running in the house?
I am calm. I don't think you get to decide that with your weird, like,
you literally threatening
trauma
to
problems.
You literally threatening to key my car and what else you threatening?
Tom, I'm gonna give you one last chance to open the door. I'm gonna leave and do what I said I was gonna do.
Kenzie, look, let me go to dinner.
No.
You can let me go to dinner, then I can let you come over later.
No, you're not, because I'm coming to dinner too.
Why? You should have told me you wanted to come.
You retard, she already put me on the reservation, so open the door, you dumb. Dom, if you do not open, you think I'm joking. Like, I'm dead.
What do you mean?
You know that's exactly what I mean. You don't know exactly what I mean. You're gonna come open this door right now, or there's gonna be a serious problem.
I can't. No, like, you can't keep making all these threats. Like, I can't open the door.
You can't keep kicking me out of a place that you say is my home.
Kenzie, I didn't kick you out. You took all your dicks and said we were done. Like,
I did not say we are done.
You can't keep making all these threats.
Stop being a little.
I can't let you in my house with how you're acting. Like, it's as simple as that.
Psychologically, this was a relationship that showed signs of a power imbalance. Mackenzie wanted control, Dominic wanted to get away or at least set boundaries, and Davion was the outsider caught in that tense relationship. When a toxic relationship reaches a breaking point, the risk of violence can increase, especially when one person sees abandonment as the collapse of their identity or social image. Psychological analysis, motive, and timeline of the offense. From a psychological standpoint, the Mackenzie Shirilla case was not treated by the court as a typical traffic accident. It was examined as an intentional act carried out through a vehicle, which made the case unusual. The object at the center of the case was not a conventional weapon, but a Toyota Camry. That distinction mattered, because the defense framed the crash as a tragic loss of control, while prosecutors argued that the car itself had been used as the means to end 2 lives. The motive, according to prosecutors, centered on Mackenzie's relationship with Dominic Russo. They argued that Mackenzie did not want Dominic to leave her, and that the crash came from control, anger, and an inability to accept losing power in the relationship. To prosecutors, the emotional conflict was not just background information. It was part of the reason the vehicle ended up on Progress Drive that morning. The defense and Mackenzie's family saw it differently. They maintained that the crash was not planned and may have been tied to a medical episode, a loss of consciousness, or a gap in memory. That disagreement became the central question of the case. Was this a devastating accident, or was it a deliberate act? Before 2022, Mackenzie and Dominic had known each other since school and had been dating for years. By late 2021 or early 2022, Mackenzie had moved in with Dominic. His family had once viewed her as part of their lives because she was often in their home. On the surface, it looked like a serious young relationship. But beneath that closeness, the relationship was unstable. By June and July of 2022, according to testimony, the relationship between Mackenzie and Dominic was getting worse. Dominic was considering ending it. Several witnesses described Mackenzie as reacting strongly, when Dominic tried to pull away or discuss a breakup. For prosecutors, those details helped explain why the possibility of losing Dominic became important in understanding what followed. On the night of the 30th of July, 2022, Mackenzie, Dominic, and Davion Flanagan attended a gathering in Strongsville, Ohio. Court records placed the group at a graduation party around 10:15 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. Later, Life 360 data from Davion's phone showed that the group was at a house on Brushwood Lane from about 11:39 p.m. until around 5:30 a.m. the next morning. Those digital records helped investigators rebuild the hours before the crash with precision. At about 5:30 a.m., on the 31st of July 2022, Mackenzie drove a Toyota Camry with Dominic and Davion inside. They left the Brushwood Lane area in the early morning hours. According to the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, after turning onto Progress Drive in Strongsville, Mackenzie accelerated to about 100 miles per hour, or roughly 161 kilometers per hour. This was not a busy highway. It was an area where the road, the timing, and the direction of travel later became central to the prosecution's theory. At around 5:36 a.m., the car passed through a business sign and struck the Plidco building near Progress Drive and Alameda Drive. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan died at the scene. Mackenzie was seriously injured, but she survived. At first, the scene could have looked like a severe early morning crash involving young people after a night out, but the physical and digital evidence later changed how investigators in the court understood it. The prosecution's core argument rested on the condition of the vehicle, the data from the car, and the movements captured before impact. The car did not show a mechanical failure that would explain the crash. The brakes were not used in the final seconds. The accelerator had been pressed hard. Appellate court records later noted that the event data recorder showed the accelerator was fully pressed in the seconds before impact, with no braking during the final 4.6 seconds. The data also showed a sharp steering movement before the car hit the building. Psychologically, this was the point that made the court reject the simple explanation of losing control. The judge did not need Mackenzie to remember every final second. The court looked at the vehicle data, surveillance video, route, behavior before the crash, and the relationship history. Together, those details supported the conclusion that the crash was not merely the result of confusion or a medical event. It was found to be intentional, shaped by a relationship that prosecutors said had reached a dangerous breaking point. That is why the timeline matters. The case was not built on one emotional claim or one moment of courtroom interpretation. It was built through a sequence of events: a strained relationship, a late-night gathering, a documented route, a sudden acceleration, no braking, a sharp steering movement, and two young men who never had a chance to leave the car. In the court's view, those facts did not point to a random accident. They pointed to purpose. After the impact, the crash scene was not discovered right away. According to prosecutors, the Toyota Camry was badly damaged in a quiet industrial area in the early morning hours. The location was not a busy residential street, and there were few people nearby at that time. For a period of time, the vehicle remained there without anyone immediately realizing what had happened. About 45 minutes later, a passerby came across the crash site and called police. The Strongsville Police Department and emergency responders were then sent to the area near Progress Drive and Alameda Drive. When first responders arrived, they found a scene that initially appeared to be a severe high-speed vehicle crash. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were both deceased at the scene. Mackenzie Shirilla was still alive, but she was trapped inside the wreckage and needed to be rescued. Emergency personnel focused first on securing the scene, reaching the surviving driver, and confirming the condition of the passengers. At that moment, the case could have looked like a tragic early morning crash involving three young people who had been out late, one car striking a building, two passengers gone, and one injured survivor. Because the first appearance of the scene resembled a roadway tragedy, investigators did not immediately begin with the assumption that it was a murder case. There were factors that seemed to support a possible accident explanation. Mackenzie had THC in her system. There were questions about whether she could have lost consciousness. Her family and defense later pointed to a medical condition known as POTS. Mackenzie also said she did not remember the moment of impact. Taken together, those details made the crash appear, at least at first, as something that might be explained by impairment, a medical event, or loss of control. But as investigators began reviewing the scene more carefully, the case started to shift. They examined the physical evidence, surveillance footage, vehicle data, and the background of Mackenzie's relationship with Dominic. The most important concern was the absence of braking before impact. The data also showed that the car accelerated forcefully before striking the building. those findings did not fit easily with a simple accident narrative. Over time, the case moved from a catastrophic crash investigation into a criminal inquiry focused on whether the act had been intentional. Investigation, scene examination, and evidence collection. The investigation into the Mackenzie Shirilla case was especially strong because it relied on technical evidence. This was not a case built mainly on a confession, and it did not depend on one single witness. Instead, investigators worked through several independent layers of evidence, each one helping them determine whether the crash was a tragic accident or an intentional act. At first, the scene could have been viewed as a severe high-speed crash, but when the road, the vehicle, the camera footage, and the digital records were examined together, the case began to take a different direction. The first layer of evidence was the crash scene itself. The location was the area of Progress Drive and Alameda Drive in Strongsville, Ohio, where the Toyota Camry struck the Plidco building. Investigators examined the direction of travel, the point of impact, the business sign that had been hit, the brick wall, the debris field, and the final position of the vehicle. These details helped establish the path the car had taken before impact. Prosecutors later argued that the route Mackenzie chose did not match a logical route if the purpose had been simply to take Davion Flanagan home. That became part of their argument about intent, because where the car went mattered almost as much as how fast it was moving. The second layer was the event data recorder, often referred to as the vehicle's black box. This became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Court records showed that the accelerator was pressed fully in the final seconds before impact. The data also showed that the brakes were not used during the last 4.6 seconds, and that there was a strong steering movement to the right before the vehicle struck the building. For prosecutors, this information was critical because it allowed them to point to measurable data from the car itself. That data helped prosecutors challenge the argument that Mackenzie had simply lost control. If a driver had fainted or completely lost consciousness, it would be difficult to explain a sequence that included steering, forceful acceleration, and no braking in the final seconds. The data did not show a vehicle moving randomly without driver input. Instead, prosecutors said it showed actions consistent with control before impact. That became one of the main reasons the case moved away from a simple accident explanation. The third layer was the mechanical inspection of the Toyota Camry. A forensic mechanical expert examined the vehicle and did not find any mechanical or electronic failure before the crash that would explain sudden acceleration, brake failure, or loss of steering. The braking system was determined to be functional. This was important because a vehicle defect could have changed the entire interpretation of the case. If the car had failed mechanically, the prosecution's argument about intent would have been much weaker, but the inspection supported the conclusion that the crash was not caused by a malfunction. The fourth layer was surveillance footage from the surrounding area. Cameras captured the vehicle moving slowly and under control before it accelerated. The footage showed the car making a controlled turn before the later high-speed approach. Reports and later analysis emphasized that the vehicle appeared to use a turn signal, turned in a measured way, and then accelerated rapidly within a short period of time. This video evidence was important because it showed a contrast. Before the acceleration, Mackenzie appeared to be controlling the vehicle. After that, the car moved toward a dead-end area at a speed prosecutors said was not consistent with ordinary driving. The fifth layer came from Life 360 and phone data. Davion's Life 360 records helped investigators rebuild the timeline before the crash. The data showed where the group had been after the gathering, including the house on Brushwood Lane, and helped identify when they left in the early morning hours. Phone and digital records also helped place the movement of the group into a clearer sequence. In a case where minutes mattered, that timeline became a way to connect the social events of the night to the final drive. The sixth layer involved testimony and digital material related to Mackenzie's relationship with Dominic Russo. Dominic's family and people who knew him provided information about a relationship that had become strained. Some videos referenced in court records showed Mackenzie allegedly threatening Dominic or acting aggressively during arguments. These details did not replace the physical evidence, but they helped prosecutors explain motive. Their theory was that Dominic wanted distance, or possibly an end to the relationship, while Mackenzie did not want to lose control. Taken together, the investigation did not rest on one dramatic discovery. It rested on the alignment of many separate details: the route, the crash scene, the vehicle data, the mechanical findings, surveillance footage, phone records, and testimony about the relationship. Each layer supported the next. By the time the evidence was presented in court, prosecutors argued that the crash was not the result of confusion, vehicle failure, or an unexplained medical episode. They argued it was a purposeful act carried out through the vehicle itself. After the crash, Mackenzie Shirilla was seriously injured and taken to the hospital. She survived, but her condition required medical treatment and time to recover. In the early public understanding of the case, she could still be seen as the surviving driver of a devastating crash, not yet as the central suspect in a criminal investigation. That distinction mattered because, at first, the community was still trying to understand what had happened, while the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were beginning to face a loss that could not be reversed. During her recovery, Mackenzie remained present on social media and received attention from people who viewed her as someone who had survived a terrible accident. That response created a difficult contrast. On one side, Mackenzie was alive, injured, and being offered sympathy. On the other side, two families were grieving young men who had not survived the same crash. This difference between survival and loss became one of the reasons her behavior after the crash was later discussed so closely. Psychologically, the hospital period was complicated. A person who survives a crash that takes other lives may react in different ways. Some people become silent, some deny what happened. Some cannot remember key moments. Others avoid the reality of the event by focusing on routine, attention, or online connection. For that reason, behavior after trauma must be interpreted carefully. Not every person expresses grief in the same way, and the absence of an expected reaction does not, by itself, prove intent. Still, in this case, Mackenzie's conduct after the crash drew criticism from the public and from the victims' families. They did not see the level of visible grief they expected from the only surviving person in the vehicle. According to the way the case has been analyzed, her continued online activity and her positive response to attention connected to image or modeling opportunities became part of a larger public concern. To some observers, it appeared as though attention remained important even after the deaths of Dominic and Davion. For a documentary script, this detail has emotional weight, but it should not be overstated. Social media behavior can help explain attitude, self-presentation, or public perception. It can show how a person chose to appear after a serious event, but it should not replace the legal evidence. In this case, the strongest evidence remained the vehicle data, surveillance footage, testimony, the route, the mechanical inspection, and the history of the relationship. After leaving the hospital, Mackenzie reportedly returned to social activities quickly. The script previously reviewed described that she did not attend the funerals of Dominic or Davion, and that she later appeared at a concert while still affected by her injuries. She was described as dressed carefully, using her phone, and interacting with friends. To the victims' families, that kind of public behavior was difficult to understand because their own lives had stopped in grief. The same account also described social media posts after the crash, including content about substance use, and a Halloween video in 2022 where Mackenzie and friends dressed in a way that many people found deeply inappropriate given what had happened only months earlier. According to that analysis, the video caused anger because Dominic and Davion had recently died in the crash. From a psychological perspective, these post-crash behaviors may be viewed as avoidance, lack of visible remorse, a need for attention, or an effort to maintain a personal image. But caution is necessary. Grief, shock, denial, and self-protection can appear differently in different people. What made Mackenzie's behavior controversial was the contrast. The families of Dominic and Davion were living with permanent loss, while Mackenzie continued to appear publicly and online. In the structure of the case, this section helps show the emotional distance between the grieving families and the only survivor. It adds context, but the core of the case remained the technical evidence. At first, Mackenzie Shirilla was treated as the surviving driver in a crash that had taken 2 lives. She had been injured, she was the only person in the car who lived, and the early public understanding of the case still left room for the possibility of a tragic accident. But as investigators continued reviewing the evidence, her role began to change. She was no longer being viewed only as a survivor, she was becoming the focus of a criminal investigation. Several factors pushed investigators in that direction. Mackenzie was the driver of the Toyota Camry. The vehicle had accelerated sharply before impact. There was no evidence of braking in the final seconds. A mechanical review did not identify a vehicle defect that would explain sudden acceleration, brake failure, or loss of steering. The route and final impact point were also viewed as unusual, especially if the intended purpose had been simply to give Davion Flanagan a ride home. At the same time, investigators were learning more about the strained relationship between Mackenzie and Dominic Russo. Videos and witness accounts described earlier threats and conflict. Those details did not stand alone as proof of intent, but they gave prosecutors a possible motive that went beyond careless driving. To investigators, the case was no longer only about speed and impact. It was also about what had been happening between Mackenzie and Dominic before that morning. By the fall of 2022, the evidence had moved the case into a different legal posture. On the 4th of November 2022, more than 3 months after the crash, Mackenzie was arrested. By then, she was 18 years old because her 18th birthday came only a few days after the crash. Officers went to her family home and took her into custody. The arrest marked a turning point in the case. What had once appeared to be a fatal early morning crash was now being treated as a criminal case connected to the deaths of Dominic and Davion. The script previously reviewed described Mackenzie's parents reacting strongly during the arrest process. They wanted to protect her right to remain silent and prevent her from speaking with police without an attorney present. From a legal standpoint, that response was not unusual. Families and attorneys often advise a suspect not to answer questions without counsel, especially in a serious case. The important point is not that her family asserted her rights. The important point is that investigators had already gathered multiple layers of evidence before the arrest was made. Those layers included technical data from the vehicle, surveillance footage, the crash scene, mechanical findings, phone and location data, and statements about the relationship. Together, they gave prosecutors a foundation to argue that the crash was intentional rather than accidental. Mackenzie was later charged with multiple counts related to the deaths of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. The questioning and legal process that followed centered on the same core issue that had shaped the investigation from the beginning. Was this a tragic crash caused by impairment, medical issues, or loss of control, or was it a deliberate act carried out through the vehicle itself? Prosecutors chose the second theory, and they built the case around intent, motive, and evidence. Mackenzie Shirilla's case did not go before a jury. According to reports, her family and defense team chose a bench trial, meaning the judge would hear the evidence and decide the verdict. The strategy appeared to rest on the belief that a judge might focus closely on the technical evidence, the medical issues raised by the defense, and the argument that the crash was an accident rather than an intentional act. That choice shaped the entire courtroom process, because there would be no jury deliberation and no jury statement about Mackenzie, Dominic Russo, or Davion Flanagan. The decision would come directly from Judge Nancy Margaret Russo. Inside the courtroom, the families of Dominic and Davion carried much of the emotional weight of the case. They were not only grieving the loss of 2 young men, they were also watching a case that had first appeared to be a tragic crash become a murder trial. For them, the shift was painful. It required them to hear evidence about the final minutes of their sons' lives, the condition of the vehicle, the route taken that morning, and the relationship history that prosecutors said helped explain motive. Dominic's family provided important information about his relationship with Mackenzie. Their testimony and statements helped describe a relationship that had lasted for years but had become unstable. They spoke about arguments, about videos Dominic had recorded when Mackenzie allegedly threatened him, and about the possibility that Dominic wanted to end the relationship. Other witnesses, including friends and people who knew the group, gave information about the night before the crash, Mackenzie's behavior before the incident, and signs that the relationship was under strain. Davion's family brought a different but equally important focus to the courtroom. Davion was not simply the second passenger in the car. He was a 19-year-old young man with his own life, family, future, and value. In the script previously reviewed, his family emphasized that he was not cargo, not an afterthought, and not a minor detail in someone else's conflict. That point mattered because the prosecution theory centered largely on Mackenzie and Dominic, while Davion had been pulled into the situation through a ride that should have taken him home. The defense did not deny that Mackenzie was driving the Toyota Camry. Their main argument was that the crash was not intentional. They suggested it could have resulted from loss of control, a medical issue, or a gap in memory. One medical condition discussed was postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, known as POTS, which can cause dizziness, a rapid heartbeat, or fainting. Court records noted that Mackenzie's mother testified that Mackenzie had been diagnosed with POTS at Cleveland Clinic in 2017, but the court did not find that argument strong enough to create reasonable doubt. The medical records after the crash did not clearly show that Mackenzie suffered a medical episode that made her lose control while driving. At the same time, the vehicle data and mechanical inspection pointed in another direction. The brakes were working. The car did not show a defect that explained the crash. The accelerator had been pressed hard in the seconds before impact, and the final data did not show braking. Mackenzie and her family continued to maintain that it was an accident. After sentencing, Mackenzie read an apology to the families of Dominic and Davion. She said she was sorry, that she never wanted this to happen, and that she wished she could remember what took place inside the car. Later reporting connected to the documentary The Crash also described Mackenzie continuing to speak about memory loss around the most important moments of the case. Her behavior after the crash also became part of the public discussion. The script previously reviewed described social media activity, her absence from the funerals, her attendance at a concert, and a Halloween costume that upset the victims' families. Those details carried emotional force, but they should be understood carefully. Post-crash behavior can affect how the public views a person, but it was not the core legal evidence. The central legal evidence remained the vehicle data, surveillance footage, mechanical findings, witness testimony, and the relationship context. On the 14th of August 2023, Judge Nancy Margaret Russo found Mackenzie Shirilla guilty. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office stated that she was convicted of multiple offenses, including murder, felonious assault, aggravated vehicular homicide, drug possession, and possessing criminal tools. The judge's words became the defining statement of the trial. She said, "This was not reckless driving. This was murder." That sentence became the legal and emotional turning point of the case. It showed that the court did not view Mackenzie's conduct as careless driving that ended in tragedy. The court found that it was an intentional act that caused the deaths of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. For the families, the verdict could not restore what had been taken, but it did give the court's formal answer to the question that had followed the crash from the beginning: accident or intent. On the 21st of August 2023, Mackenzie Shirilla was sentenced after Judge Nancy Margaret Russo found her guilty in the deaths of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. The sentence was life in prison, with her first possible parole eligibility after 15 years. More precisely, the punishment was structured as 15 years to life, with the terms running concurrently. That meant the earliest point at which she could ask for parole would come after 15 years, not after serving separate terms one after another. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office confirmed the life sentence and the first possible parole date after 15 years. For the families of Dominic and Davion, the sentence answered the legal question, but it could not repair the loss. 2 young men were gone, and the court's ruling could only determine accountability, not restore what had been taken from them. Later reports stated that Mackenzie Shirilla was serving her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. Her earliest parole date has been listed in 2037. That does not mean release is guaranteed. It means she may become eligible for review at that time, and any decision would depend on the parole process. The case also continued through appeals. In 2024, Ohio appellate court records upheld her convictions. The appellate court did not overturn the trial court's findings, leaving the guilty verdicts in place. In 2026, Ohio's 8th District Court of Appeals also maintained a decision connected to a post-conviction filing that had been rejected because it was submitted too late. By that point, the criminal case had moved beyond the trial itself. The conviction stood, the sentence remained in effect, and Mackenzie continued serving a prison term that reflected the court's conclusion that the crash was not an accident, but an intentional act, with consequences that continued for everyone involved afterward.